The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar hosted by the Investor Responsibility Research Center Institute and the Sustainable Investments Institute on a new report, State of Sustainability and Integrated Reporting 2018. The agenda for the webinar today is as follows: logistics, introductions of the speakers, background about the report, an in-depth review of the research findings, and then we'll take your questions. In terms of logistics, all of the attendees are in listen-only mode, but we do encourage your questions. You'll notice you have a question box control panel. Throughout the presentation, feel free to type any questions you have into that control panel. Following the presentation of findings, we will read those questions aloud and respond to them. For your information, this session is recording and a replay will be posted later today at www.irrcinstitute.org. We encourage you to share information about this webinar and the findings on social media. You can find us on Twitter at IRC Research and at SI2 News. If you happen to have any audio issues during the webinar, please contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. We have three speakers today. The first is going to be Heidi Welsh, followed by Sol Kwan, and then John Lekumnik. Heidi's background is she's the founding executive director of the Sustainable Investments Institute, and she's analyzed and written about corporate responsibility issues since the late 1980s. Previously, Heidi helped author seasonal and annual reports on proxy voting trends starting at the Investor Responsibility Research Center. And for 16 years, she ran the monitoring program examining corporate compliance with the McBride Principles for Fair Employment in Northern Ireland. Notably, she co-authored the Carbon Disclosure Project report on S&P 500 companies, and she also set up a global sustainability metrics report for RiskMetrics analyzing 1,800 of the world's biggest companies. Sol Kwan is an analyst with SI2, and she's also a report author. The author of this report. She has researched and written about corporate responsibility issues since 2002. Most recently, she was the associate director at the Center for Political Accountability, a nonpartisan group that promotes greater disclosure of corporate political spending. Previously, she worked in the finance and strategy practice of the Corporate Executive Board and also served as the lead analyst for corporate governance at the Capital Stewardship Program of the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union. She earned her BA in International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and holds an MBA from the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. And our last speaker today will be John Lekumnik. He served as the executive director of the IRRCi Institute since its founding. And with the board of directors, he's led the organization to become a leading source of objective academic and practitioner research on an array of investment issues. He has decades of experience as an institutional investor, including time as the investment advisor to the New York City pension funds. And just a few words about both IRC and SI2 in case you aren't familiar with the organization. IRC is a nonprofit that was established in 2005, and since that time has issued more than 75 research reports that are available on the website at no charge. Essentially what the Association Institute does is it funds, disseminates objective, unbiased research on a range of issues that are of importance to investors. It's both academic and practitioner research, and the Institute hosts an annual research award with two $10,000 awards. Next month, we'll be announcing the 2018 winners. And I'm not sure if folks on the webinar saw the announcement earlier this year that the IRC Institute has selected the John L. Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware as its successor organization. The Weinberg Center has been selected to receive a grant from the IRC Institute to materially expand its environmental, social, corporate governance, and capital markets research, as well as maintain the full public access of the IRC Institute's research at no cost. The Weinberg Center also will continue to fund and manage the annual Investor Research Award. At the end of this year, the IRC Institute will be dissolved, but you can still, again, have access to all the information and apply for the research award. You can go to the Weinberg Center website, www.weinberg.udel.edu, after the end of this year for information on the IRC Institute. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Heidi, and she's going to tell you a little bit about SI2 and some background about the report. Heidi?
Thanks very much, Kelly. And I'll do this very quickly. People can refer back to this slide later on if they want. The slides for the webinar will be available on the website. So SI2 does two things. We're a nonprofit supported by institutional investors, college and university endowments who vote their proxies, as well as big pension funds and some other asset owners. We do careful, impartial tracking and analysis of issues raised in proxy season on social and environmental subjects, and we do pretty careful engagement tracking of what happens from their filing all the way through the final disposition of resolutions. We also do emerging issue research that benchmarks what's going on, not what people want necessarily, but what's actually happening in response to requests for companies to change. Usually this is on big contentious public policy issues. So this, and we've done a number of reports for the IRRCi Institute, as Kelly mentioned. And I want to also say that we've really enjoyed working with the IRRCi Institute, and it's been a pleasure to do so. Next slide, please. So just a really short bit of background on this project. SOL covers sustainability reporting for us and has for a number of years. And we realized that, she realized earlier this year that we didn't really have a good update from our work that was benchmarking sustainability reporting 5 years ago, and that nobody else had done it. And so we suggested we should do it again, and she came up with a project concept, and it focuses on integrated reporting in the context of sustainability reporting, showing sort of where we are with sustainability reporting in the S&P 500 and where we may go. So she's going to take it away and talk about the findings, and then we'll have John say a few words and have questions at the end. So go ahead, Sol.
Thank you, Heidi and Kelly. We'll start from this slide. So yes, it's been 5 years since our last report, and there just hasn't been an update of that information since then, but we realized that there were a lot of changes that's happened historically during those 5 years, namely increased expectations of the role of business and companies by the public, with increased access to the internet and free information everywhere. People are a lot more aware of what businesses are doing, and especially for younger generations, the millennials, there's this greater expectation that companies should be focused more than just the bottom line profit. And in the past few years also, notable are some global mobilizations organized by the UN, including the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. That's really in recognition of the threat of the global climate change and the increasing acknowledgement that this is happening and we need to do something about it. And a lot of organizations, public and private, have kind of mobilized around it and have been engaging the business community with it, and they have been responding. Also, along the same lines, in many different markets around the world, regulation for sustainable business practices and a little bit of disclosure has been taking hold. So, for example, is the EU directive on integrated reporting, which implementation has to be different by the member countries, but it is pending and ongoing. Next slide, please. At the same time, we also acknowledge that the amount of responsible investment around the world has continued to grow at a very fast rate. In the United States, the growth between 2014 and 2016 was about 33%, reaching almost $9 trillion US dollars in 2016. And the rate of growth for that in in the world market was about 25% growth during those 2 years, which is to say that this has really put pressure on companies to disclose data on sustainability performance, environmental, social, and economic performance. But with, and the market has seen significant maturation to the extent that one survey last year noted that 93% of the world's largest companies have already issued, corporate sustainability reports. But despite this high level of disclosure, lots of challenges remain, including inconsistency of data and lack of or difficulties in comparing that data among peers, and the lack of external verification to be able to really gauge how trustworthy that information for each company's performance is, all for investors to really be able to use this information for investment decision purposes. Next slide, please. Also in the last 5 years is this kind of emergence of 2 reporting guidelines that's for integrated reporting, which is to say supporters of integrated reporting say that the market has reached a certain point of maturation and the next phase is this combining of sustainability and financial data for investors to be able to use the information and companies to be able to practice sustainability in a more incorporated way. And those 2 reporting models are the International Integrated Reporting Council, IRRC, which takes a little more flexible approach focused on this idea of shared value creation, as opposed to being prescriptive and setting out extensive guidelines on what to report on. The second notable model is Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, which thus far is primarily in the United States, but I understand that they are expanding elsewhere. And this model has taken a little more prescriptive approach, but really focused on this idea of materiality of information, sustainability information for each of the sectors that has redefined. And I would just take a moment here to define materiality. The US Supreme Court definition, and I'll quote here, is that information is material when there is a substantial likelihood that the disclosure of the omitted fact would have been viewed by the reasonable investor as having significantly altered the, quote, total mix of information made available. So in other words, broadly speaking, information is material if its absence would alter investment decisions, if you will. And SASB has really zeroed in on this idea and kind of coming up with performance metrics that investors could use to be able to compare and analyze performance. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the impetus for, or the background of how we decided that it might be a ripe time for us to do another study on how the S&P 500 were, if and how we're issuing integrated reports. And I'll just, before we get into the main findings, I just preface here that we pulled the list of S&P 500 in May. And the list contained a little more than 500 due to same ranking of companies of market value, and we separated out certain couple of companies that had gone through a merger, such as DuPont and Dow, whose sustainability reporting practices were still separate and pretty robust each, and so we decided to count them separately. Then SI2 gathered information through 2 main sources: the company websites, their sustainability sections, and investor relations sections. And as you'll see later, we looked at the Forms 10K and the proxy statement as they were available on EDGAR, the SEC information portal. Next slide, please. And the data was collected between June and August. So this slide is just kind of the macro view of what the key takeaways were for our research. We found that 78%, so the dominant majority of the S&P 500 issued a formal sustainability report. And we've also found that integrated reporting, which will be abbreviated as IR from now on, in the group doubled, but really only from the number 7 to 14 between 2013 and 2018. We also found, though, that the integrated reporting companies were more likely to kind of see and present sustainability information as material to their business and perhaps for investors. We also found that inclusion of sustainability information in financial documents, which we'll define here as annual reports as they were available on the company's investor relations websites, 10Ks, and proxy statements. And they were increasing. For this time around, unlike our 2013 report, we really try to focus on the voluntary disclosure of sustainability disclosure or addressing of sustainability within these documents, because we thought that the market had gotten up to that point where voluntary information would be present, and the existence of such information as opposed to compliance would tell a lot more than just counting keywords on risk factors. Next slide, please. So this is a quick graphic representation of what we found. So we saw that S&P 500 groups, about 90% had a sustainability website of varying degrees of information. About 78% actually issued a formal sustainability report. About 71% had offered environmental metrics. And about 63% offered social metrics. And we'll go into this in a little more detail later. Next slide, please. Looking at the availability of sustainability reports, we found that about 68% issue time-bound and downloadable reports, as opposed to about 9% issuing web-only reports. We thought that this was a worthwhile distinction to make, to the extent that there are some qualitative differences in information access between downloadable and web-only reports. Downloadable reports had more formal structure, where information could be accessed or found more easily, and it offered consistent structure year over year, that comparability of sustainability data, performance metrics was more possible. In addition, companies that offer this format were much more likely to offer an archive of historical information, whereas web-only reports were a lot more creative and diverse in format, but could be missing critical information, such as when the information was last updated, and they were much less likely to offer historical data. Next slide, please. Here we look at the reporting rates of by sector. We found that there were 11 GICS sectors represented in the group, and most of them, all of them, had majority of companies reporting on sustainability. The categorical reporting rate ranged from 68% for consumer discretionary at the bottom of the list to 100% for telecommunications, but only Three companies were represented in that, so that's just to be noted. And the average category average for each of the sectors to have reported on sustainability, it was about 83%, which is to say that this was a little higher because we're looking at category as opposed to the 78% reporting rate for the entire sample group. Next slide, please. So when we look at the existence of performance metrics and goals presented in the sustainability reports, we found that about 90% of the sustainability reporters offered environmental metrics. And I would define here metrics as quantified measures that were comparable year over year. And SI2 counted existence of metrics rather than quantity or quality, to the extent that we were trying to take a macro snapshot of what the companies were doing rather than going beyond that to compare more granularly. We found that about 67% offered environmental goals, which is what is quantified again and time bound. Greenhouse gas emissions data, carbon emissions data, perhaps probably the most, I guess, focused on performance metrics with the existence and engagement of organizations like CDP. About 80% of the sustainability reporters had disclosed this metric. But when it came to setting goals for carbon emissions, the rate dropped slightly to 56%. Now, social metrics, examples of social metrics here would be charitable contributions, personal injury rates of workers and diversity rates, and other labor issues. Again, SI2 counted the existence of those metrics rather than the quantity, but we found that 81% of sustainability reporters disclosed social metrics, while when it came to goals, the rate dropped significantly to 40%. Next slide, please. One of the key takeaways that was surprising for us when we looked at this was this lack of external verification by sustainability reporters. We found that 61% of those companies reporting on sustainability lacked any kind of external assurance, and about 36% offered partial assurance, and only 3% offered what we would call full assurance. But even then, so partial assurance tended to be mostly when it just for a single metric, which was for GHG, greenhouse gas emissions data. And even when it came to full assurance, it was really hard to tell what the real level of assurance was due to the difference, wide variance in the language used. We saw, for example, some companies providing assurance for GHG emissions at the plant level and presenting this information with much great detail, whereas some companies just provided a few sentences saying that an external service provider reviewed our accounting system for this report and verified this information. So there's huge ambiguity when it comes to really knowing how trustworthy these performance metrics are. And this really represents existing and known investor pain points, which is to say how accurately tell how trustworthy the information is, and how to compare that information among peers with different levels of verification. Next slide, please. This table summarizes the different service providers that provided the external verification. You can see here that 17 provided external assurance without disclosing which provider provided it. But one of the maybe a notable factor is that the traditional consulting or accounting firms like EY and Deloitte and PwC were at the bottom of the list, as opposed to some of them really seem to have been favored by the companies. Next slide, please. SIT also looked at the existence of materiality analysis and stakeholder analysis in the sustainability reports. Should define here a little bit that materiality analysis, as I defined earlier for materiality, currently companies provide analysis of what's material for their sustainability management and performance in context of, mostly in context of the Global Reporting Initiative guidance. And it's disclosure on this topic shows stakeholders that companies have done due diligence on to find out what is more important to their sustainability management than others. For example, for extractive companies, spills and incidents and environmental performance may be more material than charitable giving, for example. Stakeholder analysis and materiality analysis tended to go hand in hand, to the extent that when companies disclose stakeholder engagement and analysis, they would describe how they reached out to external stakeholders to seek feedback on their performance and focus, sustainability focus. And most of the companies tended to get their materiality focus through stakeholder analysis. And we found that about 53% of the companies disclosed, sustainability reporting companies disclosed materiality analysis, and about 62% said something about how they were engaging with their stakeholders. Next slide, please. One of the most interesting findings for this exercise was that when we looked at which, Kelly, do you hear, I'm sorry, do you hear that?
Oh, I don't hear
anything?
No.
Okay, I'm sorry. There's noise on my end, I guess. All right, so getting back. What are the interesting factors when we looked at which reporting models or frameworks the companies were following? So S&P 500 sustainability reporters were following. We looked at the GRI as opposed to or as the most popular format followed by companies. CDP, not the triple bottom line reporting, but focused more on environmental or the climate GHG emissions area. SDGs index, the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a disclosure component to it, which meant that companies were kind of adding on an index at the end of their sustainability reports, showing where stakeholders could find information regarding the specific goal. And we looked at SASB and IRRC references in order to gauge the integrated reporting influence. And we found that most of the companies, 97% of sustainability reporters, were doing kind of their own thing using multiple frameworks available. As you can see in the table, that one company referenced six models and 10 used 5 models. And even companies that referenced GRI, only 6 followed it closely, telling us that the companies were really picking and choosing from the sea of reporting formats and customizing what they wanted to report and how they wanted to report. And I would note here that 35 companies reference SASB, and 4 companies reference IRRC, and almost 100 of them among the 395 reference no model at all, showing the kind of the narrative that companies are doing their own things despite the many models available. Next slide, please. SI2 also looked through the annual reports available on companies' investor relations websites, as well as the 10Ks and proxy statements available on through the SEC website. And we found that 40% of the entire group, so the S&P 500, not just the sustainability reporters, voluntarily address some aspect of sustainability in their financial filings. And I should note here that when we say addressed some aspect of sustainability, the range was huge, to the extent that it could have been a couple of sentences in a chairman's letter in the beginning of the company's annual reports, to a more full discussion of sustainability management, or even performance metrics within their 10Ks. When it came to proxy statements, we counted information that were voluntarily included outside of executive compensation and board oversight. And in that case, it meant that there was a couple of paragraphs highlighting the sustainability efforts made by the company for that year. And we found 23% of the S&P 500 to have addressed sustainability in 10Ks voluntarily, and about 16% addressed it in their annual reports without doing so in the 10Ks. And the highest level was within their proxy statements, again, voluntarily disclosed about what they've done for the year. Inclusion of sustainability was slightly higher among the group of sustainability reporters of the S&P 500. Almost 50 or 46% of the reporters had done so in their financial filings. Next slide, please. One example that I really wanted to highlight for you guys, this is an outlier, but a company called Digital Realty Trust, they had not offered a sustainability website or a sustainability report on the company website, but in their 10K, we were able to find a pretty robust discussion of sustainability issues, namely environmental issues. And they even offer performance metrics based on the SASB guidance for their sector, real estate investment trust, for the past 2 years in their 10K. And this was surprising to us because there's no other indication that the company was paying attention to these issues except in the 10K. And the mention of SASB was also interesting, really kind of highlighting that there's movement or forces behind the companies choosing to disclose sustainability data that we may not be even aware of. Next slide, please. So going on to integrated reporters among the S&P 500, I would just note here that we really counted those companies that self-declared their reports as integrated reports. Most of them had done so. The only one, it was Allstate, that had not formally declared it as an integrated report, but they had something called the Prosperity Report that was in addition to and separate from their sustainability and annual reports that combined the two information and was available in their website, even under investor relations section. So in the context, the number doubled from 7 to 14 since we last looked at the group in 2013. Most of the companies that had issued an integrated report in 2013 had done so, except two. Dow, as earlier mentioned, is in transition with merger, and their last full sustainability report in 2016 was an integrated report. Eaton, we found, just kind of transitioned into a web-only format, and they had not provided any explanation to the transition, so we wouldn't know why, but that's how they transitioned. Next slide, please. Some key observations from the integrated reporter group. We found that 7 out of the 11 sectors were represented, led by healthcare with 4 firms and utilities and industrials. We also found no real correlation with the size of company as measured by annual revenue from last year or their exposure to international market exposure. The first part, annual revenue, it was under the theory that the size of the company matters when it comes to kind of leading in sustainability disclosure, but we found that not to be true when it came to integrated reporting. The range of annual revenue for the group was between 4 billion to 120 billion among the 14 companies last year. The international market exposure, because there's increased regulation abroad for inclusion of ES data and in financial filings, we thought maybe that might have some influence on how the companies were reporting integrated reports in the US, but we found that not to be true as well. When it came to external third-party assurance of their data, we found half of the 14 companies to have provided some assurance. And this is a little higher than the 39% of general sustainability reporters. Only 2 companies, Ingersoll Rand and Clorox, provided what we would call full assurance. And surprisingly to us, the group had limited reference to SASB or IRRC, 4 citing SASB and 3 citing IRRC, with 2, Pfizer and Praxair, citing both, but the rest not citing either. Next, please. Even though IRRC wasn't formally referenced or mentioned by most of the companies, we found 11 out of the 14 integrated reporters to have mentioned this idea of creating value for all stakeholders, including the environment, customers, employees, society, and etc. And this is an idea espoused by the IRRC model for integrated reporting, and really marks kind of a departure from a singular short-term bottom line focus that's been understood traditionally for business as role of business. And we have here 2 quotes from companies addressing importance of listening to the younger generation and their higher expectation for the role of companies. And that was Allstate and Ingersoll Rand acknowledging the importance of creating value for all stakeholders, and not just for profit. And I should note that this addressing of this idea was mostly in the letter, chairman or the CEO letter contained in the integrated reports, but there were some companies, Intel comes to mind, that provided a little more in-depth analysis of how they're creating value for different stakeholders and what their different aspects of management for it. Next, please. One interesting takeaway from looking at how integrated reporters were presenting this information was that they were more likely to position sustainability as material to investment decisions. All of them offered their integrated reports in the investor relations websites, and half of them, 7, actually used it and presented it as their annual report right alongside their 10Ks. The rest there was a little split between whether it was more of a sustainability report or just a third document in addition to sustainability report and annual report. Next slide, please. But we also found that in this group, sustainability data was still unequal to the financial information. For example, as noted here, GE and Southwest Airlines, their 10Ks mention or provide links to their documents, integrated reports, or other elsewhere sustainability metrics. But as you can see from this quote from Southwest Airlines Form 10K, we found that they went out of their way to distinguish or acknowledge that sustainability data was not intended to be a part of their 10K. We found that Intel and Clorox were the only exceptions presenting sustainability in their 10K business and strategy discussions in a very robust way. Next slide, please. And consistent with other practices in the group, we found that integrated reporter companies were more likely to have board oversight of sustainability. 71% had a formal board committee overseeing sustainability issues, compared with 54% among sustainability reporters and 42% of the general S&P 500. 8 integrated reporters, 57%, highlighted sustainability efforts in their proxy statements, compared with 44% of sustainability reporters and 38% of the general sample group of the S&P 500. Next slide, please. In conclusion, this kind of highlights what we thought were notable takeaways and perhaps surprises. We were really reminded the profound challenges that remain from lack of kind of the common language and level that companies have to provide when it comes to external verification of sustainability performance data. And just the need for more congruency in the language used and kind of level of expectation that needs to be consistent in order for this information to be taken seriously. Also, it was notable that companies were definitely listening to stakeholders and making changes and going on their different sustainability journeys and finding their way through the sea of constantly evolving landscape, and that just a few leaders are really leaving the rest in the dust, if you will. But the market, or the group S&P 500 as a whole, is evolving. We also were surprised that more companies in the group were voluntarily discussing sustainability in their financial documents. Again, the example of Digital Realty Trust was pretty remarkable, and it's quite curious where the companies will choose to go next, which is to say, is integrated reporting really the next phase of sustainability reporting, and how likely the companies would, as we go forward, adopt either the IRRCi or SASB model. There was 30-something companies already referencing SASB. Will they just use the metrics as picked as material by SASB and to be reported on, or will they follow it in a more real way despite lack of regulation and more focus by other companies? It's all very interesting to see. So that is the main finding of our research. Thank you so much for listening. And I would just note here that you can find a lot more granular information in the report that's available on the IRCi and SI2 website. And here I will hand over to John. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sol. I had a great coverage of the main findings. Sol gave the facts. I'd like to give some context and sort of widen the circle around it. It is clear that investors want material environmental, social, and governance data. The Principles for Responsible Investing have investors with $80 trillion as signatories. And the very first requirement to be a signatory is, and I quote, "We will incorporate environmental, social, and governance issues into investment analysis and decision-making processes." Obviously, you need data to do that. And I find it hopeful and encouraging that issuers are increasingly providing that data. The second thing that I would note is there are sort of, in the regulatory environment in the United States, 4 nots. This data is not required. As Sol said, it's voluntary. She also noted it's not standardized, and it's largely not assured, although the level of assurance is growing. And the reality is it's not going, that those assurance and comparability are not going to improve due to any regulatory change anytime soon, at least in the United States. As she mentioned, that may be different in Europe and other jurisdictions, but it is clear that this administration and this SEC are not likely anytime soon to mandate regulatory changes to ESG data. But what's interesting is the market is evolving the way markets should to resolve the market need. There is an entire ecosystem of providers, from the frameworks, which Sol mentioned, to rating agencies, even big data artificial intelligence providers that are providing this ESG data, the framework, to investors. I mean, you can pick whichever information source you want, whether it's Thomson Reuters Icon platform or Bloomberg. Both and others have lots of ESG data available to investors, and they are being used. Next slide, please. And so even though people in the field get frustrated with the lack of standardization and the lack of assurance and the lack of regulatory movement, we should not forget how rapidly this actually is evolving. It may not be rapidly enough, but we still shouldn't go to one extreme or the other and say everything's solved or everything's horrible. 395 of the S&P 500 do issue a sustainability report. The ESG data is increasingly likely to be linked to financial data. Companies are increasingly using quantifiable metrics. And as Sol said, while there's not strict adherence to standards or frameworks, their influence is clearly being felt. So it's not all doom and gloom, neither is it all bright, shiny rays of sunshine. Call it partly cloudy or partly sunny, but it has moved from total darkness to some level of light. Next slide, please. So we are moving ahead, investors are moving ahead, issuers are moving ahead, and other stakeholders are moving ahead rather than waiting for regulators and lawmakers. But as Sol said, there is a Supreme Court definition of materiality, and companies are required to disclose material information. So the question becomes, when is there a tipping point and that this sort of information is considered routine so that a reasonable investor would want it in the total mix? At that point, there doesn't even need to be a regulatory change. There just needs to be a court case that says, yes, this has now become material and in the mix. So the directionality of sustainability reporting is clear. We are moving towards materiality and we are maturing. Only the pace is uncertain, and I think this report is a wonderful report and will serve as a benchmark for the future. Finally, if you will allow me, let me have a point of personal privilege. This is the last commissioned report that the IRRC Institute will be putting forward. As Kelly said earlier, we do have our paper prize. We have just selected the winners, but have not yet announced them. They are wonderful papers, and we look forward to announcing them shortly. But this is the last commissioned report. It's appropriate that SI2 be the final partner of ours in putting forth a report. We have done about 80 reports, give or take a few. SI2 has done 8 or 9 of them, so 10% of them, and they have always done a great job on them. But it has been our privilege, speaking not just for myself and the staff, but for the board of IRRC, to be able to put out papers like this, which are objective, unbiased, just the facts, let all sides, have their opinions, but share the same set of facts and move the debate forward. So I wanted to thank everyone on the phone and all the other people who have benefited from our research reports, the regulators who have cited them, and the investors who have used them, and clearly our research partners who have provided them. That is personal privilege. It is probably too long, so I will stop there, and we will move on to questions about the report for Heidi, Saul, or myself. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We're now on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. As a reminder, if you have any questions, there's a question box on your control panel. Type your question into the box. I'll read it aloud, and either John, Heidi, or Sol can take a crack at answering your question. Let's see what we have here. So I'll just start right at the top. Have you seen the annual Green Transition Scoreboard 2018 report, Capturing CO2 While Improving Human Nutrition and Health, where we cover the global shift away from animal-raised meat and the startups in plant-based proteins? We use both the SSAB and the IRRC model, so that's more of a comment. John or Heidi or Saul, you want to weigh in on that?
Single answer, yes, I've seen it.
Yeah,
I don't know what the question
I would just
is.
say it doesn't seem like there's a question there. Yeah.
So the next question, thank you for that. The next question is, how many of the companies you researched have adopted SSAB standards?
Sol, do you have a shot? I think we have not that many, because you have to remember that when we are doing this research, actually the final iteration of the SASB standards was not out. It only came out about a week before we released this report. There were provisional standards. There were some changes in the final ones. We thought it was actually remarkable, the amount of reference to SASB, just given that they weren't finalized yet. So it seems to have some legs, certainly among early adopters.
I'll just add a sentence now that I'm unmuted. We didn't see a full following of their guidelines. What we did see were just references saying that we looked at SASB and GRI and other models when we prepare this report, or in the case of Digital Realty Trust, mentioning or referencing in that way, in a kind of a piecemeal or selectively, as opposed to following the whole model.
Thank you. Our next question, what percentage of companies included downloadable reports on their website, mostly from sustainability or from investor relations?
So that was in that slide. It was it 68% that provided the downloadable reports, and I think it was another 8% that had web only, 9%. So, yeah. Does that answer the question?
That was in the slide also, just to get back to the SASB question. 35 companies reference SASB. That doesn't mean they've necessarily adopted the framework.
Thank you. The next question, you say that 61% have no assurance, but if the indicators you are reviewing are in the formal financial disclosure documents, such as annual reports, 10Ks, and proxies, they must have been reviewed by internal and external auditors?
So
that's not. Go ahead, Saul, and then I'll chip in.
Oh, you can.
Not necessarily true. Some have been disclaimed, and also the 60. That's only the ones that are more likely to have been at least partially assured are in the financial statements. But for instance, if they are not part of the actual financial statements, if they are not a footnote or in the financial statements, the only requirement of external auditors is to read and consider, not to fully assure.
Right, and the 61% represents external assurance of sustainability reports and the data contained therein, and not financial reports, as in the case of the quote from Southwest Airlines, where there were companies that we've seen where they provided links to 10Ks, as in the case of Southwest Airlines. They went out of their way to note that the information should not be considered as part of the 10K. So there's that distinction made by the companies on purpose.
Thank you. The next question, can you elaborate a bit more about what sort of language was defined as sustainability disclosures in the 10K reports?
So there was just a huge variance. Our first check was to do a keyword search of their annual reports and their 10Ks and the word sustainability, and several other keywords related environment and climate change, etc., or labor. And it was there was that group of companies that addressed sustainability or the importance of sustainability and management in the CEO or chairman's letter, and then and that could have been 2 sentences or a few paragraphs or even more, just depending on the company, and the rest were as in the case of Digital Realty Trust, and there are other companies that have actually included sustainability metrics, especially when it comes to the greenhouse gas emissions, that actually included some performance metrics in their sustainability or in their 10Ks. So it just really varied widely. And one of the key challenges actually for our research in general was to be able to really kind of find the patterns, to be able to find findings for you, but we had to shift a few times, if you will, because what we were finding, there was just a huge variety. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Right.
I think if I could just say one thing, John. So I would say that what we were looking for is sort of and what we found most interesting was the sort of extraordinary placement, sort of extra placement. Everyone has seen a 10K. It has very typical, it's got risk factors, it's got the MD&A, all of that. We were looking for something really outside that to try to get some sense of the extent to which companies were talking about these things as sort of special, important material issues for the company, and highlighting that.
Thank you. The next question, I can take this one. Can we distribute information about this webinar and the visuals to our email list and subscribers? The answer is absolutely yes, and we very much appreciate that. Following this webinar, I'll get the PowerPoint slides posted as well as a replay to this webinar, and then I'll send everyone links to those. So, we very much appreciate you disseminating the information either by email or social media, whatever works best for you. The next question, are there any efforts to update international standards to drive down the cost of E&S assurance, which is a barrier?
I would say there's lots, but one thing that we found pretty interesting, and John has written about this elsewhere, is that, and it's on that table, the big four, the top sort of accounting firms are not the most prominent players in here, and I think you could say that if there is a real drive for more assurance of sustainability information, and the big four may be sort of missing out, and these smaller, more agile players are moving in. Certainly, in terms of long-term sustainability of accounting firms, if they're not looking at quote unquote non-financial factors, and everyone wants that information, they may be really missing a bet.
I'll revert to just the facts portion on this one. The CFA Institute did a survey about 2 years ago as to what level of assurance investors would want and what investors are willing to pay for it. I am working from memory here, but my recollection is that investors at that time were willing to pay about 10 to 25% the cost of a financial audit for E&S sustainability assurance. And that it was evenly split in terms of investors wanting assurance, thinking it needed to be at the level of a Big Four or a CPA firm, I shouldn't just say Big Four, a CPA firm versus a different specialty firm. So assurance is less mature than reporting. But clearly is moving that way. I should note that the AICPA did have a major project in terms of setting assurance standards for greenhouse gas emissions. So you will see, for instance, that GHG emissions are the most commonly assured thing. And I don't know if those were finalized, but there are either final or at least draft AICPA guidelines on that. So again, things are evolving. The directionality is clear, but it's also clear that it's not yet mature.
Thank you. I know it's the top of the hour. We've got a few more questions in the queue, so I'll just keep plowing through those. So we appreciate your patience. Do you have any insight on the latest court cases in this area? Do you expect to see any major cases that may help define materiality or require companies to reveal material sustainability data?
I think that's beyond the scope of this, unless, I mean, we've all read about them, but I don't know that we have insight beyond what we've read as third parties.
Our next question, were there any sectors where sustainability reporting patterns were more consistent and comparable?
Well, what I thought, if I can say, and Sol, you might want to chime in on this, I think it is worth looking at that one slide where we talked about the different levels of sustainability reporting in the different sectors. And notably, the information technology sector was one of the least likely to do sustainability reporting. And I think everyone has read the headlines about the sort of challenges in terms of human capital management in that sector, in terms of discrimination cases and equal employment opportunity cases. And so that brings up an issue of sort of, you know, are you going to be able to attract the best and brightest if you haven't grappled with a very persistent, problematic controversy? And it seems that there's a gap, particularly in the tech sector, between investor and other stakeholder interest in information and company performance in terms of disclosure.
I couldn't give you a complete answer to this question because we didn't look at the data in that way. But I will say that for real estate investment trusts or real estate investment development companies, there were actually surprising number of companies disclosing sustainability even at the lower level of the S&P 500 list. There was a kind of the sector-wide effort headed by a newer reporting model, GRESB. It's elaborated more fully in the report that came out a couple of years ago, and a lot of companies took part kind of in a beta trial basis, and there seems to be a lot more movement in that relatively a small sector than perhaps some others that I've seen. So.
Thank you. The next question, did the study look at any correlation between disclosures and stock price or other business success metrics?
No, it did not.
We did not, but I happen to know that there is a paper either coming out or will be coming out from a professor at the University of Memphis that talks about sustainability disclosure and stock price movement. Since it's not our paper, I prefer not to talk about it, but I'm sure you can find it on SSRN.
And I would just add that we'd be, potentially happy to collaborate if anyone is interested in doing such a study. Phil, did you have something to add?
Well, so speaking of third-party studies, there's one study cited in the report that doesn't talk about correlation to stock prices or performance, but what it does talk about is this correlation with investor makeup of companies who are leaders of sustainability disclosure. This study found that companies that are leading in disclosure and performance of sustainability tend to have more longer-term investors holding their assets, through the trials and tribulations of market tastes, and that is indirectly related to performance. So take a look at that in the report.
Then our last question, does the panel have any thoughts on what the report might look like for small or mid or small cap companies? Is regulation the only way forward?
I'll take a stab at it. I don't think so. One of the surprising things that we found were there is some correlation with size of companies when it comes to sustainability data, but the landscape is in such a flux and in an evolution mode that it really, I don't think that what's been done in the past is really indicative of what will happen in the future. As just I mentioned in the real estate investment companies, most of them are at the bottom of the list when it comes to market cap, but a lot of them actually have already taken steps to measure their greenhouse gas emissions and prepare their reports. And it may not be the robust disclosure data of some of the bigger and more mature companies like DuPont or Exxon, but it's happening. So I can't say that I wouldn't say that regulation would be the only way in the future for smaller companies.
One other thing I would say is we have done a series of reports most recently on the governance of microcap companies, and it is clear that reforms move from large cap down, and that the adoption rates for, as you get to truly microcap companies, is much less of what might be called standard governance provisions, but it does move down from large cap to mid cap to small cap. So what you could probably do is taking Saul's advice, commentary into account. It will be varied and slower adoption as one moves further down the cap chain, if it parallels the governance provision adoptions, but it won't be non-adoption. It won't be that regulation is the only choice, although it may be a good choice. I'm not getting into that discussion here. But that some will adopt, but it will be fewer and it will be slower than at the S&P 500 level.
And I would just add one thing on this point. I've been doing sustainability research for a long time, and I helped out in terms of doing some of the research for this, and I was really amazed at the depth and breadth of sustainability reporting all the way down the cap chain. We have really come to a new place. And I think it's partly because people are thinking about sustainability, environmental and social issues, not just as risks, but also as places for opportunity. Clearly, if you look at the accountancy world, it seems like some smaller, potentially more agile players are really seeing opportunity in sort of assuring some of this information. And likewise, some of the smaller companies may be able to move more quickly and perform better and get new business from paying attention to these issues.
Well, that concludes our questions and concludes the webinar today. So we thank all of you for your participation and interest today and throughout the course of the IRRC Institute's journey. Again, we will send out information to all of you with a link to a replay to this webinar in case you'd like to share it with others, as well as the PowerPoint slides and the report itself. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.